I'm Higgons. I'm a tax partner with Mills Oakley Lawyers in Melbourne. Today I'm going to give you some insights in relation to loans, in relation to private company groups and interest deductibility. So the first point is, don't have a loans mess. Sometimes people have a whole lot of entities, and wherever the money happens to be at the time, if they need it, they just pay it out from there, and then they've got a loans mess. It's an absolute nightmare. Every time you have a loan, you have to consider things like asset protection, and you have to consider tax effectiveness, of, deductibility of interest and so forth. And if you just fire loans all over the place, first of all, it creates an accounting mess, but it also potentially creates a nightmare in those areas. So, for example, in relation to asset protection, if you've got a need for money, and say the business entity has the money, if you loan it out from the business entity, that's not necessarily a good thing. If that business entity gets in trouble, goes into liquidation, guess what? It's going to call on that loan and drag down the other entity. So typically, if you need money and it's a business entity that's got it, in many cases the business entity can, say, repay a loan that it might owe to a safe entity, and the safe entity loans it down for the new project or whatever. So you try and think about asset protection. Also in relation to asset protection, when you're giving a loan to an entity and you're acting as your own banker, you've got to put your banker hat on. What would a banker do? A banker would take security. So you should take security. A lot of people don't think about that. They think, oh, I'm just lending to myself. Yes, but what you're trying to do is protect yourself against the third-party creditors. So always take security for your own loans back to a safe entity. Then you think about tax effectiveness. If you borrow, you want a tax deduction for the interest. Now, in some cases, if you don't structure it properly, you will not get the tax deduction for the interest. So you've got to think, for example, if you're on lending. So an entity has an interest cost in relation to a borrowing, and all of a sudden some other entity needs money. If you just lend it across interest-free, and there's not a nexus with getting income back, you're not going to get a tax deduction for your loan, for your interest. And that's no good. So in many cases, you've got to put in place the right sort of documentation and make sure that you don't lose your interest deductions. Another one is anything to do with a company. You've got this nasty Division 7A. And so if you have loans out of a company which aren't repaid fairly promptly or aren't on a complying loan basis, you can get deemed dividends, unfranked, very nasty. So very careful about any loans coming out of companies. Doesn't mean you can't do them, just means you need to get advice. And the same with trusts. They've extended where a trust has an unpaid present entitlement owing to a company and it has a loan out of the trust. Same issue arises. It can be a deemed dividend from the company. So be very careful about that. There are ways to cut off that problem, but again, you need advice and you need to put steps in place so that you can have your loans coming out without causing problems. Either that, or again, you've got to put in place a complying loan agreement. So you've also got to consider, in relation to loans, in some cases you could put in debt or equity. You certainly don't want a situation where you're giving a loan, having interest in the lender and paying tax on it, and then having a deduction in the borrower, and it's a loss entity and you're not getting the effective benefit of that deduction. That's not tax effective. Paying tax, no effective deduction. So you might consider, instead of perhaps lending in, of having equity, and then you get over that problem. So there's lots of things that you should think about when you're giving loans, both from an asset protection point of view and an interest deductibility point of view.